Officer Dale Kowalski had always believed that the courtroom was a place where men like him won, where the union showed up, where the blue wall held, where a good defense attorney with a sharp suit and a sharper tongue could turn a jury around before the prosecution even finished its opening sentence. And for the first 40 minutes of the trial in courtroom 14 of the Dirksen Federal Building, he had almost convinced himself that this time would be no different. Almost. He sat at the defense table in a charcoal gray suit that had cost him $800 and felt under the relentless fluorescent lighting of the federal courtroom like a costume he had borrowed from a man with more confidence than he currently possessed. The room smelled of old mahogany and recycled air and something else underneath both of those things, a kind of settled institutional gravity that federal courtrooms carry the smell of decisions that outlast the people who make them. His hands were flat on the surface of the table, pressed down hard. Not because he was trying to look calm, but because if he did not press them down, they would shake, and he could not afford for the jury to see his hands shake. Not today, not when everything was riding on the next few minutes. His attorney Frank Del Vecchio sat beside him in a suit that cost twice as much and fit considerably better. And Del Vecchio was doing what Del Vecchio always did before the critical moment of a trial, which was to sit very still and project an aura of unshakable confidence so complete that it was almost contagious. Almost. Across the mahogany divide in the witness chair he had occupied for the better part of the morning sat the man whose life Kowalski had disrupted on a rain-soaked Chicago street 9 months ago. And just looking at him made something cold and unpleasant move through Kowalski's chest, because the Honorable Judge Marcus Ellington Webb did not look like a man who had been dragged from his car and pinned to the hood and humiliated and bled onto the wet asphalt of Halsted Street. He looked like a man who had been waiting with infinite patience for exactly this moment. His silver hair was immaculate under the fluorescent lights. His posture was the posture of someone who had spent 15 years sitting in a chair that commanded the attention of every person in the room. His hands rested in his lap around a pair of reading glasses he had not yet needed, and he was looking at nothing in particular with the focused, unhurried calm of a man who had already decided how this ended. Somewhere in the gallery behind Kowalski, a pen scratched across a notepad. A camera shutter clicked once. Then the room settled back into its thick, watchful silence. 9 months ago, Kowalski had stood on a dark, wet street at midnight and felt invincible, felt the particular electric certainty of a man who has always gotten away with it. Now he sat in a federal courtroom with his hands pressed flat on an $800 suit and tried to remember what invincible had felt like. Frank Del Vecchio leaned toward him close enough that his cologne was briefly overwhelming and said 4 words in a voice just barely above a whisper. The 4 words that had been Del Vecchio's operating philosophy through 31 combined years of Kowalski's use of force complaints and union interventions and quiet internal affairs resolutions. No video, no conviction. He said it the way a doctor says a diagnosis he is confident in, without drama, without hesitation. Because Del Vecchio had built his entire reputation on the foundational truth that juries in Chicago did not convict decorated police officers on the basis of one man's testimony alone, even if that man was a federal judge, even if the injuries were real, even if the arrest report read like what it was, which was fiction. Kowalski nodded. He believed it. He needed to believe it. Across the room, Assistant United States Attorney Patricia Owens rose from her chair, buttoned her jacket, and walked to the light switch panel mounted on the wall near the jury box. She was 42 years old, and she had the unhurried, methodical energy of someone who does not waste motion. And she did not look at Kowalski when she dimmed the lights, did not need to, because the evidence she was about to present did not require her to perform for the gallery. A digital projector in the ceiling hummed to life. Kowalski watched the white rectangle appear on the courtroom screen. He watched Owens reach into her files and retrieve a small remote control. And somewhere deep inside his chest, beneath the $800 suit and 9 months of Del Vecchio's reassurances, the thing that had been almost calm became something else entirely, became a cold and dropping certainty. Because Owens was not looking at the jury, and she was not looking at Del Vecchio, and she was not performing for anyone. She was simply pressing a button, and the screen was filling with an image that Kowalski recognized before he could stop himself from recognizing it, and the smirk that he had been wearing like armor since the morning dissolved off his face in a single second. They had tape. 9 months earlier. Halsted Street, 11:52 p.m., rain. The rain had been coming down steadily since mid-afternoon. The kind of slow, determined November rain that Chicago specializes in, the kind that does not announce itself dramatically, but simply settles in and makes itself comfortable, and reminds you that the city is serious about its winters. By the time Judge Marcus Ellington Webb stepped out of the Dirksen Federal Building at 11:38 p.m. on a Tuesday, the streets around the Federal Plaza were dark and wet and empty, in the particular way that late-night Chicago empties a city that has cleared its sidewalks but not really gone to sleep. A city where the lights are still on in the upper floors and the L trains still run, and somewhere always there is noise. Webb had been inside since 7:41 that morning, 14 hours and change, which was not close to a record, but which sat in his body the way long days always did, as a specific kind of heaviness concentrated in the shoulders and behind the eyes. The weight of decisions that mattered laid one on top of another, until you carried something substantial by the time evening turned to the small, quiet hours. The day had included a capital sentencing review in the morning, the kind of work that requires you to hold the full weight of the law and the full weight of a human life simultaneously, and find the balance point between them and a complex civil rights pretrial briefing in the afternoon that had run 4 hours and consumed the energy of everyone in the room. He walked to his car, a black Buick LeSabre that was conservative and understated and 7 years old, and he got in and he did what he always did before he drove home, which was to sit for 90 seconds with the engine running and the radio off. Not meditating exactly, not praying exactly, but allowing the transition to happen at its own pace, allowing Judge Marcus Webb to set down the robe and the gavel and the weight of the bench for the night, and become Marcus Webb the man again. Marcus Webb, who was married to Gloria, and who had a daughter in Atlanta and a son in Seattle, and who liked good jazz and bad detective novels, and who made his own coffee at 6 a.m. before anyone else in the house was moving, just because the quiet of that hour belonged entirely to him. 33 years in the law. He had started as a public defender in 1991, 1 year out of Northwestern Law School, representing clients that most people had already written off. He had moved to the federal prosecutor's office after 8 years, not because he had stopped believing in the defense side of the equation, but because he had come to understand that the quality of justice in any system depended on the quality of the people enforcing it. 12 years as a prosecutor, careful and thorough and known for never overcharging. And then 15 years ago, the appointment to the Northern District of Illinois, the robe and the gavel and the particular solitude of the bench where you sit above the argument rather than inside it, and you are required to see both sides with equal clarity and find the narrow path of the law between them. He believed in the system. Not naively, not without understanding its failures, not without knowing in his bones the ways in which the law that protected some people also failed others, because he was a black man in America, and he had been a black man in America for 61 years, and there was not a single day of those 61 years in which that fact had been irrelevant. He believed in it anyway. He believed in it the way you believe in something you have tested and found true in the places that mattered most. The 90 seconds ended. He put the Buick in gear and pulled south on Halsted Street, 2 miles from home. The blue and red lights erupted in his rearview mirror like something detonating, and Webb felt the familiar cold settling in his chest that had nothing to do with fear exactly, and everything to do with recognition. He signaled smoothly. He pulled to the curb under the pale cone of a streetlight. He shifted into park. He turned on the interior dome light. He placed both hands on the steering wheel at the 10 and 2 position. In the rearview mirror, he watched the silhouette of a police officer get out of the cruiser. The officer moved toward the Buick with a swagger that carried its own vocabulary, the heavy, deliberate thud of someone who has learned to use his physical presence as a statement, one hand resting on the butt of his service weapon, with the casual intimacy of long habit. Webb watched him come and noted the posture and the hand position, and filed all of it carefully because 33 years in the law had made him a man who gathered evidence instinctively, automatically, even when the evidence was being gathered about something that was happening to him. His name was Dale Kowalski, and he had been on the Chicago Police Department for 11 years. And in those 11 years, he had accumulated a jacket of excessive force complaints that would have ended the career of an officer without the right union backing and the right precinct relationships. 7 formal complaints in 5 years. 2 settled quietly out of court, the payouts absorbed by the city's risk management fund without a single public word. 3 others buried in internal affairs reviews that concluded each time with the phrase insufficient evidence to sustain. And one, the worst one, involving a 22-year-old delivery driver named Curtis Reeves, who had spent 4 days in the hospital with a fractured orbital socket that had been resolved when the union's attorney convinced Reeves's family that a civil settlement was faster and more certain than a criminal charge that would face a jury in Cook County. Curtis Reeves had taken the settlement. He had moved to Indianapolis the following year. Kowalski had gone back to work 11 days after the incident with a letter of reprimand in his file and a nickname in the locker room that he wore like a medal. They called him the Hammer. He had never corrected them. He had a rookie partner tonight, Shane Briggs, 25 years old, 8 months on the job, sitting in the passenger seat of the cruiser and watching Kowalski with the particular attention of someone who understands that he is being educated whether he likes it or not. Before Kowalski got out of the cruiser, he said something to Briggs, leaning toward the passenger seat with the conversational ease of a man sharing professional wisdom, and he said, "Nice car, wrong neighborhood, wrong color." And then he said, "Let me show you how we keep the peace out here, kid." He said it the way a man says a thing he has always believed, a thing so central to his understanding of his own authority that it requires no justification, no awareness, that it might be the clearest possible statement of everything that was wrong with him and everything that would eventually destroy him. Kowalski tapped his body camera with the flat of his palm, a habitual gesture, the way a man checks his wallet before he leaves the house. The camera was off. It had been off since before he ran the plates. Briggs watched him tap it and said nothing. Kowalski walked to the Buick. His tactical flashlight tapped against his palm as he moved a rhythmic territorial percussion tap-tap-tap, the sound of a man marking his approach in the dark. Webb lowered the window halfway. The rain blew in cold against his face, speckling his wool suit. He said, "Good evening, officer. Is there a problem?" And his voice had the measured baritone of a man accustomed to speaking in rooms where silence followed his words. Kowalski shone the tactical flashlight directly through the gap and into Webb's eyes, full beam blinding, the kind of thing you do to remind someone immediately that you control the terms of this encounter, and he said, "License, registration, and proof of insurance now," and did not explain the reason for the stop. Webb said, "Officer, if you could please lower the light. My wallet is in my breast pocket and my registration is in the glove compartment, and I will reach for them slowly." And his voice was calm. Genuinely calm. Not the performed calm of someone suppressing panic, but the actual calm of a man who has spent decades learning the difference between what frightens him and what he will allow to govern his behavior. Kowalski did not lower the light. He moved it closer. He said, "You people always got an answer for everything, don't they?" And said it the way a man says a thing, so often repeated in private that it comes out in public, without him even noticing, said it as casually as a comment about the weather. And those words hung in the wet air between them. Webb's jaw tightened. He breathed through it. He kept his hands visible and his voice level and reached slowly into his jacket for his license. He handed it over. He reached for the glove compartment. Kowalski stepped back sharply, manufactured the panic in his voice, and shouted, "Keep your hands where I can see them," and his hand dropped to his service weapon and unholstered it an inch. Webb froze. Hands immediately back to the steering wheel. He said, "Officer, you asked for my registration. It is in the glove compartment. I am not a threat to you. and said it clearly and distinctly in the way that you say something when you understand it may be the last thing you say. Kowalski grabbed the driver's side door handle. He ripped it open. The door swung wide with a violence that had nothing to do with necessity. Before Webb could unfasten his seatbelt, Kowalski's hand was on the collar of his wool suit jacket. He yanked. Webb came out of the car sideways. His knees hit the asphalt hard. Cold water soaked immediately through the fabric of his trousers. The shock of the impact traveled up his spine in a bright, immediate wave. He said, "What are you doing? I am not resisting." Kowalski shoved him forward onto the hood of the Buick, the hot metal of the engine pressing against Webb's cheek through the rain. Then Kowalski was behind him, wrenching his left arm backward and upward, and the pain came like something tearing loose inside the shoulder, a hot, blinding rip that traveled from the joint down through his upper arm, and Webb heard himself cry out once before he clamped down on it. Not for Kowalski's satisfaction, not giving him that. Not tonight. Kowalski drove his knee into the small of Webb's back. Full body weight. He leaned close to Webb's ear, close enough that the stale coffee and nicotine smell of him were immediate and overwhelming, and he said in a voice pitched so only Webb could hear it, "You're just another suit who thinks the rules don't apply to him." Then he said, "Out here, I'm the judge." The steel cuffs went on, ratcheted down hard, too hard, cutting off the circulation to Webb's fingers within seconds. Shane Briggs stood beside the open door of the cruiser. He was 10 feet away. He had seen all of it. He stood very still with his hands at his sides and his face the face of a young man who has just watched something he cannot unwatch, and he did not move forward, and he did not move back, and he did not say anything at all. Webb turned his head slightly as Kowalski marched him toward the cruiser. The rain was in his eyes, and his shoulder was burning, and his hands were already going numb, but he turned his head, and he looked at the street around him with the precise, deliberate attention of a man taking inventory. He saw the buildings. He saw the streetlight. He saw above the entrance to a bank branch on the corner a drive-through ATM alcove recessed from the sidewalk, with a high-definition exterior security camera mounted at the top of the alcove entrance, angled outward. Its lens pointed directly at the section of curb where the Buick was still idling with its dome light on. Webb did not stop, did not nod, did not change his expression in any way. He filed the camera away in the part of his mind where he kept evidence, and he let Kowalski push him into the back of the cruiser, and he sat there with his hands behind his back and his shoulder on fire, and he breathed in and out, steady, and he began to wait. The cruiser interior smelled of fast food and stale coffee, and the particular chemical neutrality of a car that is cleaned by someone other than its occupants. And Webb sat in the back behind the cage with his hands cuffed behind him and watched through the steel mesh as Kowalski settled into the driver's seat with the specific physical ease of a man coming down from an adrenaline high that he has experienced enough times to recognize as enjoyable. The loosening of the shoulders, the slight backward lean, the exhale of a man who has done what he set out to do. Kowalski was in a good mood. He hummed something low and tuneless, tapped the steering wheel twice with one finger, and drove with the unhurried confidence of someone who has no doubt whatsoever about the outcome of the next several hours. That confidence, that visible, settled, even cheerful certainty, was in some ways the worst thing Webb had seen tonight. Worse than the flashlight in his eyes, worse than the manufactured panic, worse even than the knee in his spine, because it told him something specific and important about the man in the driver's seat. This was not a new story for Kowalski. This had a shape that Kowalski recognized. The man had done this enough times, in enough variations, that it had become comfortable, had become part of the rhythm of his nights. Kowalski said to Briggs, without taking his eyes off the road, "That's how you handle an attitude problem." And then he said, "Title or no title on this street at midnight, my word is the only law that matters." And he said it with the satisfaction of a man delivering a lesson he is confident in. Briggs sat in the passenger seat and looked out the window at the wet Chicago streets scrolling past and said nothing. At a red light at the intersection of Halsted and 18th Street, Kowalski reached into the breast pocket of his uniform shirt. Not the department-issued phone on his duty belt, but his personal cell phone, the one with the cracked lower left corner and the Northwestern Wildcats sticker on the back case, and he held it below the dash at an angle not visible to any traffic camera, and he typed with one thumb, smiling as he did it, the small, private smile of a man sharing good news with people who will appreciate it. What he typed, what he carefully composed and read back to himself once and then sent to a group text thread titled, "2nd District Brotherhood," was this. Bagged a live one on Halstead suit in a car. Thought he was somebody put him on the hood and tuned him up. Good body cam stayed dark, lol. The LOL was 3 lowercase letters. 3 keystrokes. He added them without hesitation, the way you add punctuation to a sentence, the way you sign your name, the way you do a thing that is so natural and so automatic that it no longer carries any weight of consideration at all. And in that effortlessness was the full portrait of Dale Kowalski, the man who had never once entertained the possibility that what he did in the dark might someday stand in the light, who had built his entire existence on the assumption that the accountability that governed other people's lives was something he was exempt from, who had just typed the sentence that would end him. He pocketed the phone. He reached up with one casual hand and touched his body camera, confirming it was off. The way a man confirms his stove is off before he leaves the house. In the back seat, Webb watched the glow of the phone screen below the dash and saw the smile, and saw the phone go back into the breast pocket, and he noted all of it, the way he noted everything. The shirt pocket, the personal phone, the specific angle at which Kowalski had held it away from the rearview mirror, and he added it to the inventory he was building in his mind. Briggs turned his head slightly toward the back seat, and his eyes met Webb's through the cage for just a moment, and what was in Briggs's eyes was not hostility and was not indifference, but was something Webb recognized from 33 years in courtrooms, the specific expression of a person who knows they have just made the most consequential mistake of their life, and is only now beginning to understand the full dimensions of it. Webb looked away. He had what he needed. The 2nd District Precinct, on a rainy Tuesday night at 12:14 in the morning, had the specific institutional atmosphere of a place that runs continuously and has long since made its peace with the idea that not everything that happens inside it is admirable. Fluorescent-lit linoleum, particle board desks, the particular ambient sadness of a building where people are regularly brought against their will. The air smelled of wet wool and institutional cleaning product and the metallic undertone of old stress, and somewhere down the hall from behind the holding cell doors, there was the distant periodic mutter of a man working through something difficult in his sleep, punctuated by the static crackle of a dispatch radio in a room Webb could not see. 2 officers near the far end of the room looked up when Kowalski came through the double doors with Webb assessed the situation in a practiced glance, and looked back down at their work with the studied incuriosity of people who have learned to see less than they see. Kowalski brought Webb to the booking desk with a hand between his shoulder blades. That was not quite a shove, but was not a shove either, and announced him to the desk sergeant in a voice pitched for the room rather than for the desk. 148, resisting arrest, combative, refused lawful orders, reached for his waistband, dynamic takedown for officer safety. Performing the narrative the way you perform a story you have rehearsed enough times that the performance has become the memory. Sergeant Lou Mancini was 49 years old and had been sitting at this desk for 19 years and had therefore developed a considerable expertise in the face a person makes when they are trying to maintain their dignity in circumstances that are designed to strip it from them. He looked at the man Kowalski had just brought in. The ruined wool suit, the bleeding cheekbone, the hands cuffed behind the back, the left shoulder sitting at a wrong angle, and he looked at the face above all of that, at the posture, at the way the man was standing, and something in Mancini's 19 years of desk sergeant pattern recognition sent a very quiet signal that he chose for the moment to file and not act on. He said, "What do we got?" Kowalski, and waited. Kowalski recited the arrest narrative chest-forward voice official, the language of a police report being written in real time, and Mancini listened and typed and asked one question, looked at the cheekbone and the shoulder and asked, "He need a bus, meaning an ambulance," and Kowalski said he's fine, just a scrape slippery out there. Mancini looked at the scrape. He typed what he typed. Webb was uncuffed, and the feeling began to return to his hands in the way feeling returns after that kind of restriction, which is not pleasant, which is a burning, prickling, gradually intensifying wave of pain moving through the fingers, and Webb suppressed it completely, did not shift, did not wince, did not acknowledge it in any way that Kowalski could read his weakness. He stood at the steel counter and emptied his pockets in a calm, methodical sequence. His keys, a Mont Blanc pen his daughter had given him for his 60th birthday, his wallet, his cell phone, a folded hearing schedule for the following morning that had 14 cases on it. Kowalski picked up the Mont Blanc pen and turned it over in his fingers and said something derisive about it, something meant to be diminishing, and Webb watched him set it back on the counter and said nothing. What Webb did instead was gather evidence with the focused efficiency of a man who has spent 33 years building federal cases. He noted the booking number that appeared on Mancini's monitor when the screen briefly angled toward him. He noted the timestamp on the wall clock, 12:14 a.m. He noted the name badge on the officer standing near the coffee machine who had glanced up when they came in. Hendricks. He noted Briggs standing near the far wall with his arms crossed staring at the floor. He noted the angle of the security camera mounted in the upper corner of the booking area. He was gathering everything. He watched Kowalski at the terminal typing the arrest report with 2 fingers, and the focused aggression of a man constructing a story while he still has the luxury of being the only one who knows what actually happened. He watched Kowalski type erratic driving, then smell of alcohol. Webb had not had a drink in 6 years, had not had a drink since a New Year's Eve resolution that had become simply how he lived, and he watched the word alcohol appear on the screen, and he breathed and added it to the inventory. The department policy governing a detainee's access to legal counsel was a thing Webb had cited in written opinions on 3 separate occasions over the past 11 years, and he could reproduce the relevant section numbers without reference materials, and he did addressing Sergeant Mancini directly and clearly, stepping around Kowalski the way you step around an obstacle that is not worth engaging. Citing the policy and the constitutional provisions it reflected. 5th Amendment, 6th Amendment. The specific procedural requirement that access to counsel could not be denied after the commencement of processing without constituting a violation. And he said, "I want my phone call now." Mancini paused. He looked at the way the request had been delivered, at the specificity of the citation, and he looked at Kowalski, and then he pushed the desk phone across the counter without a word, which was itself a small and significant thing. Kowalski said, "Make it quick, pal," and turned back to his terminal. Webb dialed from memory. The number had been in his head for 11 years, lodged there the way important numbers are, without effort, without intention, simply present when needed. It rang 4 times. Chief Judge Raymond Ashford of the 7th Circuit Court of Appeals answered on the 4th ring with the groggy irritation of a man who has been woken after midnight by a call he was not expecting. Webb said, "Raymond, it is Marcus. It is past midnight, I know, and I am at the 2nd District Police Precinct, and I have been assaulted and arrested by a patrol officer on fabricated charges, and I need you to make a call." He gave Ashford the precinct address and the name of the arresting officer and the badge number, which he had memorized. At the moment, Kowalski stepped out of the cruiser and he listed his injuries with the same clinical precision he had used to describe everything else since the handcuffs went on. Torn rotator cuff, facial lacerations, handcuff neuropathy, and he said, "Make the call, Raymond." The line went quiet for 5 full seconds. Then Ashford said, "I will." The line went dead. Webb placed the receiver back on the cradle. He stood straight, Kowalski was leaning back in his chair with the comfortable half-attention of a man who considers the call a routine procedural request that will produce nothing of consequence. Webb looked at Kowalski directly and said, "I want you to remember tonight clearly, Officer Kowalski," and said it in a voice that was quiet and level and absolute. Not the voice of a threat, but the voice of a statement. The voice of a man delivering information he is confident in, and he said, "Not what you wrote in that report. What actually happened." And then he said, "Because the truth has a way of finding the light, and when it does, you will not get a second chance to correct yourself." Kowalski looked at him for a moment, and then smiled the particular smile of a man who has heard similar speeches from similar people and has found them uniformly unpersuasive, and he waved one hand in a dismissive half-gesture and turned back to his screen. Briggs, standing against the far wall, watched Webb's face during this exchange, and then looked at the floor and then looked at his own hands. 8 minutes passed. Then the double doors at the front of the precinct flew open with a force that registered above all of it, and Captain Gerald Sutter came through them at a speed that was several grades above his usual commanding entry. His uniform shirt partially buttoned over a white undershirt, his hair undone from its usual order, his face carrying the specific quality of color that belongs to a man whose blood pressure has just made a dramatic and involuntary decision. Sutter moved through the precinct with the urgency of a man running towards something he simultaneously does not want to find. His eyes swept the room in a single pass before locking on to the booking desk, and he crossed the floor and said, "Where is he?" And Mancini said, "Where is who, Cap?" Because Mancini genuinely did not yet understand, and Sutter did not answer because at that moment his eyes found the man standing at the booking counter in the destroyed wool suit, and the answer became simultaneously obvious, and for Sutter, catastrophic. The color left Gerald Sutter's face. All at once, like someone had turned a valve, he went from the flushed urgency of a man who has run up 2 flights of stairs to the bloodless pallor of a man who has just understood something terrible. And his right hand reached out and found the edge of the counter and gripped it with the mechanical reflex of a man whose knees have made a decision his mind has not caught up with yet. His coffee sloshed in the cup he was carrying, and he set it down before he dropped it, and it sat on the counter and steamed, and nobody moved for a full second. Sutter had testified in Webb's courtroom 4 years ago, had appeared as a departmental witness in a funding dispute involving the 2nd District's overtime allocation records, and had spent 3 hours under Webb's careful and impeccably courteous examination, and he had not forgotten a single moment of it. The dark robes, the gavel, the voice that moved through a federal courtroom the way a weather system moves through a landscape, commanding and inevitable, filling every corner of the space it occupied. And the man standing at the booking counter with a swollen cheekbone and a left shoulder sitting wrong and steel handcuff marks still visible on his wrists was that voice, that presence, unmistakable, standing in his precinct at 12:23 in the morning while Kowalski's arrest report accumulated fabrications on the terminal behind him. The 3 layers of recognition hit Sutter in sequence, each one worse than the last. First, the physical fact of the man, bloody and bruised and still possessed of an absolute composure that was itself an indictment of everything that had been done to him. Second, the specific memory detonating behind Sutter's eyes like a flare going off the memory of Webb's courtroom, the robes, the bench, the gavel, the precise authority of a man who had spent 15 years being the final word in matters of federal law, mapped over the image of this same man on his knees in wet asphalt, while Kowalski's knee was in his spine. Third, the eye contact. The eye. Webb looked at Sutter, and Sutter looked at Webb, and what Webb's eyes offered was not anger and not satisfaction, and not any of the things Sutter had unconsciously braced for it. Was the calm of a man who understood exactly what was going to happen next, and had been waiting with infinite patience for the people responsible to arrive at the same understanding. Sutter said, "Judge Webb, sir," and began to say something further that would have been an apology, and would have been inadequate when Webb cut through it with the quiet efficiency of a man who does not have time for inadequacy tonight. He said, "Captain, I have a torn rotator cuff facial lacerations and handcuff neuropathy in both hands. sustained when your officer dragged me from my vehicle without cause, assaulted me against the hood of my car, and brought me here under a fabricated arrest report. I want a department photographer down here in the next 20 minutes to document my injuries before any further treatment, and I want transport arranged to Northwestern Memorial for evaluation of the shoulder. And I want Officer Kowalski suspended from duty, effective immediately pending the investigation that will be opened into this matter in the morning. The word judge, once Sutter had said it, moved through the precinct the way current moves through water. Instantaneous. Total. Touching everything at once. The keyboard stopped. The peripheral conversation stopped. The two officers who had come back to the coffee machine stopped. Briggs, against the far wall, looked up. Kowalski had gone very still at his terminal. He had not turned around yet. His hands were hovering over the keyboard, suspended, and whatever expression was on his face in that moment was something only Mancini could see from the desk. And Mancini would later describe it in a deposition given 7 months later as the expression of a man watching the floor give way under him. Kowalski turned around. He looked at Webb. He looked at Sutter's face, and he read Sutter's face with the accuracy of a man who has survived 11 years in a complex institutional environment by understanding which way the wind is blowing, and he understood with absolute clarity that the wind had just changed direction, had in fact reversed completely, and he made the decision that men like him always make in the moment when they understand that retreat is no longer possible. He doubled down. He said, "Cap, the camera malfunctioned, and the slight tremor in his voice was audible to everyone in the room, and he said, 'But he was resisting, he was reaching, he didn't tell me who he was,' and each sentence landed flatter than the one before it." Webb looked at him for a moment, and then he said in the tone of a man delivering a ruling that is not subject to appeal, "The camera is not the only thing recording tonight, Officer Kowalski." And then he turned back to Sutter and did not look at Kowalski again. Sutter suspended Kowalski on the spot. Briggs watched from across the room as Kowalski removed his badge from his chest and set it on the counter with a sound that in the silence of the precinct seemed very loud for so small an object, and Briggs stood there with his arms at his sides and his hands open, and he did not sleep that night, and he would not sleep properly for the next 6 months. By 7:45 the following morning, Frank Delvecchio was sitting at Dale Kowalski's kitchen table in Kowalski's house in Bridgeport, and there was coffee on the table, and Delvecchio had not made it, because Delvecchio did not make coffee in other people's kitchens. He arrived with his briefcase and his custom suit, and the particular controlled energy of someone who has been called in to manage things, and whose bill reflects the speed with which he shows up. The speed of his arrival was itself a statement, a demonstration of the machine's ability to mobilize. Delvecchio's operating principle was simple, and he stated it plainly right there at the kitchen table before the coffee was halfway finished. No video, no conviction because, he said with a federal judge is still a he said. And the jury you get in Cook County is not a jury that convicts decorated police officers on the word of a powerful man who feels his dignity was offended. He said it with the absolute confidence of a man whose entire professional reputation had been built on the reliability of that pattern. By noon, the union's public statement was out distributed to every media contact the fraternal order of police maintained in the city, which were many. The statement said that Officer Kowalski had been performing a routine traffic stop in good faith, that the vehicle had exhibited observable driving irregularities, and that when the stop turned non-compliant, Officer Kowalski had employed appropriate and documented de-escalation techniques before the use of minimal and necessary force. The statement further said that the subsequent involvement of the officer's supervisory chain had been influenced by undue political pressure from the victim's position in the judicial system. 3 retired CPD officers appeared on a local afternoon radio program and discussed the case with the practiced sympathy of men who have been asked to do this before, and 2 of them used the phrase race card within a 15-minute segment, and one of them said the phrase powerful man with no accountability for his behavior. And none of them mentioned the torn rotator cuff or the handcuff neuropathy or the fabricated police report or the body camera that had been off before Kowalski left the cruiser. Webb watched this from his living room in Hyde Park, his left arm in a sling following the surgical repair of the rotator cuff that Northwestern Memorial had confirmed 2 days after the incident. An ice pack against his cheekbone, and his wife Gloria sat in the chair across from him with a cup of tea, and the expression of a woman who has been married to a federal judge for 31 years and has therefore developed an extensive vocabulary for patience, and she asked him quiet and direct what he wanted to do. He said nothing, not yet. I want them to believe they are winning. Then he went to his desk and he wrote from memory a federal civil rights complaint. 14 pages single-spaced. Every timestamp, every name, every physical detail, the exact words of the stop the specific escalation sequence, the text of the conversation he had heard through the cage on the drive to the precinct, the locations of every person who had been present in the precinct when he arrived, the angles of every camera he had observed. And at the end of it, he wrote the address of the Midwest Federal Savings Bank branch on Halsted Street, and the description of the ATM camera he had observed above the drive-through alcove. He wrote it the way he wrote judicial opinions, precisely and completely, with the understanding that the document would eventually be read by people who were going to act on it. He put it in an envelope. He addressed it to the desk of AUSA, Patricia Owens, Northern District of Illinois. He sealed it. He asked Gloria to mail it in the morning. Patricia Owens read the complaint in a single sitting on a Thursday morning in her office on the 15th floor of the Dirksen Federal Building, which was the same building where Webb had his chambers 3 floors up. Though they had not spoken since the incident and would not speak until the investigation was formally opened, because Owens understood that independence was not merely procedural, but was the actual foundation on which the case had to be built if it was going to hold. What struck her about the complaint was not the injuries, which were serious, and was not the name charges, which were clear, and was not even the identity of the victim, which was significant, but the quality of the documentation. The specificity of it, the fact that a man who had been dragged from his car and assaulted and held in a precinct booking area while a false arrest report was being constructed had been gathering evidence the entire time, noting timestamps and badge numbers and camera angles with the trained precision of someone who understood that the only way to fight the blue wall of silence was to build your case before the wall went up. She began her investigation from the outside in. She did not call Webb first. She pulled traffic camera records, precinct radio, dispatch logs, booking intake records from Mancini's terminal, and she sent a paralegal to physically walk the block of Halsted Street, where the stop had occurred, with instructions to identify every exterior commercial surveillance camera within a 200-foot radius of the described location. The paralegal came back with 7 cameras. 6 had been aimed at their own properties and would have captured nothing useful. The 7th was the ATM exterior camera of the Midwest Federal Savings Bank branch at 2208 South Halsted, mounted high on the alcove entrance, angled outward over the street, its field of view covering the curb, the sidewalk, and a direct, unobstructed sight line to the location Webb had described with a precision that Owens now understood was not a coincidence, but was the product of a federal judge noting his surroundings while his hands were being cuffed behind his back. The bank's security footage backed up automatically to off-site servers every 4 hours. The footage had not been overwritten. Owens subpoenaed it on a Tuesday with a federal magistrate's signature that took 40 minutes to obtain, and she watched it alone in her office the following morning with the door closed and the blinds down. No expression on her face during the 8 minutes of playback. And then she watched it again from the beginning, and when it ended the second time, she set down the remote and picked up her phone and called the FBI's public corruption liaison at the Chicago field office and said, "I need a digital forensics warrant for a personal cell phone," and explained why. The warrant for Kowalski's personal cell phone produced the 2nd District Brotherhood text thread, and Owens read it in sequence, read the exchange that had happened in the weeks before the Webb stop, and the weeks after. It read the texture of what the men in that thread said to each other about the people they policed and the supervision they avoided and the cameras they managed. And at the end of it, she came to the message sent at 12:17 a.m. on the night of the incident while Webb was bleeding in the booking area, and she read the 3 lowercase letters at the end of it, and she set the phone down on her desk and breathed through her nose for a measured moment before continuing. She worked for 7 months without leaks. Kowalski and Delvecchio, hearing nothing, concluded that the silence was the sound of a case that was going nowhere. It was not. In the 5th month of the investigation, Owens found Arthur Gaines. He was 58 years old, and he ran an auto repair shop on the South Side, and he had been paying Dale Kowalski $200 every 2 weeks for 36 months. Not because he wanted to, and not because he had done anything wrong, but because Kowalski had walked into his shop on a Tuesday afternoon 3 years ago and told him in the particular friendly and entirely serious way that Kowalski had of making threats, that the city inspector's office had received several anonymous complaints about code violations at his property, and that these complaints had a way of either accelerating or disappearing depending on the relationship between a business owner and the officers who patrolled his block. Gaines had understood what was being communicated and had made the calculation that a working man makes when the alternative to paying is losing everything he has built, and he had paid and had kept paying, and had hated himself quietly for every payment. The total was $15,600. Owens told Gaines what she had and what she needed, and Gaines agreed to testify in exchange for formal federal witness protection status and full restitution of the $15,600. And he agreed, not because of the money, he said, but because he had a grandson who was going to grow up in this city, and he did not want his grandson to grow up in a city where this was the normal way of things. Shane Briggs had filed his supplemental report the morning after the arrest, sitting at a precinct terminal with Kowalski standing close enough to read over his shoulder, and he had written the words the report required him to write. Combative subject, refused verbal commands, furtive movements, officer safety, and he had signed it with his name and his badge number and the date, and he had gone home and sat on the edge of his bed in his apartment in Pilsen and stared at the wall for an hour before he could make himself eat. He had not slept properly since November. He had started waking at 3 a.m. and lying in the dark with the arrest on a loop in his memory, not the parts Kowalski had scripted, but the parts that no report captured. The way Webb's knees had hit the asphalt, the angle of the left shoulder after the cuffs went on, the way Webb had looked at him through the cage from the back seat, not with anger, not with accusation, but with the clear-eyed recognition of a man who understood exactly what had been done and exactly who had chosen not to stop it. 6 months after the arrest, Briggs was dispatched to a domestic disturbance call in South Shore, and he arrived to find an elderly black man standing in his own doorway in his bathrobe, his front door hanging off one hinge, where a responding officer from a prior call had kicked it in without sufficient cause. And the man was not angry, was not threatening, was simply standing there with the particular quality of exhausted dignity that belongs to someone who has been in this situation before and has learned to wait it out. And he had Webb's posture exactly the same, straight back and level eyes, and the absolute refusal to surrender composure in the face of a system doing its best to take it from him. Briggs drove home after the shift and called the Federal Ethics Hotline and reported what he knew, and called back the next day and gave his name. Owens met him in a parking structure in Evanston on a Wednesday evening, the two of them standing between a concrete pillar and a support beam, with the garage's ambient rumble around them, and she offered him precision, which was the thing that actually helped, which was to tell him exactly what the federal statute said about perjury and conspiracy to deprive civil rights and exactly what the mandatory minimum sentencing guidelines produced for those charges when applied to a 25-year-old with no prior record, and exactly what it would take to put Briggs in the category of someone who had made a frightened mistake rather than a deliberate choice. She told him he had one opportunity to make that choice. She told him it would require complete disclosure. Everything. In writing and on record. Briggs looked at the concrete floor for a long moment and then looked at her and began to talk, and he talked for 2 hours and 20 minutes without stopping. The Dirksen Federal Building was one of those structures that understood its own purpose, a building that had been designed to communicate through the scale of its lobby and the weight of its doors and the deliberate somberness of its interior finishes. that what happened inside it mattered in ways that outlasted the people involved in any particular case. Courtroom 14 on the 9th floor had the specific gravity of a federal civil rights trial in a major American city. You could feel it in the air the moment you walked through the double doors. The mahogany walls absorbed the sound. The gallery pews creaked softly as people settled. The smell of old wood and recycled air and the scratch of reporters' pens filled the silence in the way that silence in important rooms gets filled. The gallery was full by 8:30 in the morning. Civil rights organization representatives occupied the left rows of pews with the orderly attention of people who take careful notes and compare them afterward. In the right rows, a section that had in earlier pretrial hearings been occupied by off-duty CPD officers in plain clothes. Making a point, there were fewer people today, more gaps in the pews than at prior hearings, the blue wall showing its first structural cracks before the trial had even begun. Kowalski sat at the defense table in his gray suit, trying to project the look of a wronged civil servant. Del Vecchio sat beside him, expensive watch custom lapel, confident in the way that very expensive attorneys are confident before they have seen all the evidence. Webb was not in the courtroom for opening statements. His absence was deliberate. It was the statement of someone who does not need to be in the room to be present in the case. Del Vecchio went first, and he was good at this. It was impossible to pretend otherwise. His opening was built around a single narrative frame. A powerful man, a federal judge accustomed to the full weight of institutional authority bending toward his preferences, had been stopped in a routine traffic enforcement action and had responded with the entitlement of someone who had never in his adult life been made to wait. He did not use the word arrogant, but he arranged the words around it until arrogant was the word you were thinking. He said that Officer Kowalski, a 10-year veteran of one of the most difficult patrol districts in the country, had not known he was stopping royalty, had only known he was stopping a non-compliant driver. He used the phrase race card once carefully in a sentence that was technically about the prosecution's strategy rather than his own characterization, and the sentence was constructed precisely enough that its meaning was clear while its deniability remained intact. Patricia Owens stood when Del Vecchio sat down, and she buttoned her jacket, and she walked to the podium, and she stood there for a moment without speaking, which was itself a choice. The choice of someone who has nothing to perform and understands the difference between performance and evidence. And then, she said, the government will prove that the defendant committed a deliberate, premeditated act of violence against a citizen of the United States, and then attempted to conceal that violence using every tool that his badge and his union and his partnership with a subordinate officer provided him. The government will not ask you to take anyone's word for what happened on Halsted Street on the night of November 14th. We have the evidence. We will let it speak. She sat down. Her entire opening had taken 4 minutes. Del Vecchio looked at the jury, and the jury looked at Owens, and Del Vecchio's comfortable certainty shifted very slightly in a direction that was not reassuring. Marcus Webb took the witness stand in a dark navy suit with his left shoulder carrying the slight stiffness that remained after the surgical repair, a physical limitation so minor in its visible effect and so total in its constant presence that he had come over the past 9 months to think of it not as damage exactly, but as information, a reminder that carried itself in the body rather than in the mind, and he moved to the stand with the careful deliberateness of a man who has learned to accommodate what cannot be corrected, and to do so without drawing attention to the accommodation. He took the oath and sat and looked at Patricia Owens and waited. Owens walked him through the events of November 14th in a direct examination that lasted just under an hour, and what made it devastating was not the content, but the manner of it, which was the manner of a federal judge giving testimony precise and unemotional and organized with the internal logic of someone who has spent 3 decades distinguishing between what he observed and what he concluded. This produced something the gallery had not been expecting, which was a quality of controlled grief that was more affecting than any display of distress could have been. He described the dome light. He described the hands at 10 and 2. He described the survival protocol that any black man in America learns to follow in certain contexts, regardless of the degrees on his wall, and he said this without editorializing and without bitterness. And the jury, which included 4 people over the age of 50 who had lived in this city their entire lives, understood exactly what he meant and felt the full weight of what it meant in a way that no explanation could have produced. When he described the moment the door was ripped open and his knees hit the asphalt and the shoulder gave way, he stopped for 3 full seconds. Not for the jury's benefit, but because the body remembers things, the mind is organized and filed, and the body's memory is not always subject to the same discipline. And then he continued, and the jury watched a man describe his own humiliation with the composure of a surgeon describing an operation, and the effect on the room was profound and total. Delvecchio attacked on cross. He came at it from the angle of compliance, framing Webb's request for the stop's justification as provocation, and Webb said, "I asked for the reason for the stop, as is the right of every American citizen under the Fourth Amendment. Mr. Delvecchio," and he said it with the patience of a man who has explained the Fourth Amendment in open court on more occasions than he can easily count. Delvecchio came at it from the angle of the dark car and the dark windows and the split-second decisions of a man policing a difficult district. And Webb said I told him exactly what I was reaching for. I moved deliberately and slowly, and his alarm was manufactured to justify the violence he had already decided to employ. Delvecchio's final move was the one he had planned from the beginning, the theatrical turn to the jury with the spread hands and the resigned shrug. The case comes down to his word against a decorated officers, and without video evidence there is simply no way for this jury to know what actually happened on that street. Webb looked at Delvecchio for a long moment, just long enough to let the jury see that he was looking, and then he said, "Mr. Delvecchio, I have spent 15 years on the federal bench watching witnesses lie, and I know what lies look like. And the court is going to see exactly what happened on Halsted Street, and I am confident that the truth is going to be enough." Delvecchio sat down with the air of a man who has scored his point. Owen stood for redirect, and she was very quiet, and she asked Webb exactly one question. "Judge Webb," she said, "where exactly on Halsted Street were you pulled over?" Arthur Gaines walked to the witness stand in a pressed white shirt and dark trousers that he had bought at a department store the previous weekend, specifically for this day, not because he was trying to impress anyone, but because he had been raised to dress carefully for occasions that mattered, and this occasion mattered more than any he could remember. He walked with the steady, unhurried pace of a man who has made his decision and is not going to allow himself to be rushed past it. He was 58 years old, and he had run his auto repair shop on the South Side for 26 years, had built it from a 2-bay operation with 1 employee to a 7-bay operation with a reputation in the neighborhood for honest pricing and reliable work. And he had protected it and maintained it through every economic cycle the South Side had experienced in those 26 years. And then for 36 months, he had been paying Dale Kowalski $200 every 2 weeks. He testified to the arrangement in the plain direct language of a man who does not have formal legal training and does not need it. Because what he was describing was not complicated. It was extortion, and extortion does not require sophisticated terminology to be recognizable for what it is. He said, "Kowalski told me the city had complaints about my property, and he said the complaints would either move forward or go away depending on whether we had a good relationship, and I understood what he meant, and I was afraid of losing my business, and I paid." The notebook was what the jury remembered. Gaines had kept a composition notebook, the spiral-bound kind, and he had written in it, after each of Kowalski's visits, the date and the amount, and what Kowalski had said because his father had told him when he was 17 that when a powerful man wrongs you, you write everything down. The notebook had 31 entries in Gaines's careful handwriting, 31 dates and 31 amounts, and 31 short summaries of what Kowalski had said. The total at the bottom of the last page was $15,600. Delvecchio's cross came from the angle of motive. Gaines was testifying because the federal government had offered him restitution, was testifying in exchange for a financial benefit, and his account should be understood in that context. Gaines looked at Delvecchio and said, "I came forward because I spent 3 years ashamed, and I don't want my grandson growing up thinking that I just paid a bully and called it the cost of doing business, and I didn't come forward because of the money. I came forward because of the notebook, because I wrote it all down, and the notebook says what happened." The jury looked at the notebook. They did not look at Delvecchio. When court resumed after Gaines's testimony, Delvecchio filed a motion to limit the scope of prior conduct evidence. The presiding judge denied it in 2 sentences and moved on. Owens stood and said, "Your Honor, the government calls Judge Webb back for redirect examination on a matter not previously covered," and Webb returned to the stand, and Owens stood at the podium and said, "Judge Webb, you testified earlier that Officer Kowalski pulled you over on Halsted Street. Can you give the court the most precise location you can recall?" Webb said, "I was stopped at the curb in front of 2208 South Halsted Street, and I can give you that address with confidence because I made a point of observing the street number on the building at the moment I was brought to the curb." Owens said, "And do you know what business operates from that address?" Webb said, "Yes. It is a branch location of the Midwest Federal Savings Bank, and it has a drive-through ATM alcove, recessed from the sidewalk on the south face of the building." Something happened on Kowalski's face at that moment that was different from everything that had happened on it since the trial began. Something more specific. The face of a man who is running through the footage of his own memory and arriving at a specific night and a specific street and a specific camera he had or had not noticed above a specific drive-through alcove. The calculation going on behind his eyes was visible to anyone who was watching, and Delvecchio was watching, and the watching was making Delvecchio's face do something it had not done since the first day of trial, which was to lose its certainty. "Your Honor," Owens said, "the government introduces Exhibit 31. It is a high-definition exterior surveillance recording subpoenaed directly from the Midwest Federal Savings Bank's private off-site security servers, captured by the ATM alcove camera at 2208 South Halsted, which had a clear, unobstructed, continuously illuminated view of the street and sidewalk and the curb directly in front of the property on the night of November 14th. This footage has not been edited, filtered, or altered in any way." Delvecchio was on his feet before Owens finished the sentence objecting on discovery grounds, and Owens produced the supplemental discovery filing with the date and the docket number and said it was logged and transmitted to defense counsel 11 weeks ago as part of the commercial surveillance supplemental. And if Mr. Delvecchio's team failed to screen the footage in that folder, that is not a discovery violation, Your Honor. It is a preparation failure on the part of defense counsel. The presiding judge looked at Delvecchio for a moment that lasted slightly longer than its official duration and said, "Overruled. Mr. Delvecchio, proceed, Ms. Owens." Delvecchio sat down. He sat down the way a man sits down when he knows that something irreversible is about to happen, and there is no procedural mechanism remaining to stop it. The monitors mounted on the courtroom walls flickered to life in the dimmed room, and the image that appeared on them was not the grainy, low-contrast footage of the kind of surveillance camera that gets shown on local news after a parking lot altercation. This was not a fisheye lens or a washed-out image. This was crisp and sharp, and unapologetically clear, captured in high definition under the permanent bright white illumination of the bank's ATM security floodlights, and every face in the courtroom could see every detail of every second. The timestamp in the lower right corner read 11:58 p.m. November 14th. The footage showed the street as Halsted Street looked at midnight in the rain, the sodium streetlights haloing in the wet air, the empty sidewalk glistening, and into the upper left corner of the frame, a black Buick LeSabre entered and signaled and pulled smoothly to the curb directly under the camera's field of view. The interior dome light came on inside the car the moment it stopped visible through the windshield, a small, warm light in the dark street, and the silhouette of the driver was clearly visible with both hands on the steering wheel. The second car entered the frame from the right. A figure got out, walked toward the Buick, the tactical flashlight tapping against his palm as he moved tap, 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 visible even in the footage, the physical habit of a man who did not know he was being filmed. The figure reached the car. The flashlight went up, aimed through the window. The driver's hands stayed on the steering wheel. Still. Completely still. The viewer could see the measured reach into the jacket, the hands coming back, and then the door being grabbed and ripped open harder and faster than any traffic enforcement stop requires. And then the older man was out of the car, his knees on the asphalt. And then the figure had him by the shoulder and was driving him forward onto the hood. The courtroom gallery gasped. A collective sound. Not a single gasp, but a shared one, the kind of involuntary response that a room full of people produces when they see something happen that they had been told about and half believed and are now watching with their own eyes. The gasp lasted for just a moment before the room went very quiet, the quiet of people who are watching something they know they will remember. Because what the camera showed in its clarity under the bank's floodlights was not ambiguous. A man with both hands on the steering wheel being taken from his car by force. A man on his knees on the pavement making no movement that could be interpreted as resistance. A man being driven onto the hood and held there with the full weight of his attacker pressing into his spine. And the face of the man doing it turned at an angle in the floodlights, turned in a way that was entirely accidental, simply the result of the geography of the camera and the geography of the assault. The expression on that face was not the expression of a frightened officer in a high-stress situation making a split-second judgment about an unknown threat. It was the expression of a man who was enjoying himself. Owens paused the video on that frame. She left it there, frozen. Kowalski's face under the bright white lights, and she did not say what the expression was because she did not need to, because everyone who looked at it knew what it was, and some of them were old enough and had lived in this city long enough to have seen it in rooms and on streets that they had spent decades trying to leave behind. She let the footage play to its end. She let the jury watch Briggs in the background, standing still at a distance of 12 feet, while the man on the hood made no resistance, none, not a single movement that could justify what was being done to him. Then she said, "Judge Webb is the man who assaulted you in this footage. The same man currently seated at the defense table." Webb turned his head and looked at Kowalski. He did not look at the frozen frame. He did not need to. He looked at the man himself, and Kowalski looked down at the mahogany table, before the eye contact was fully established, could not sustain it, could not find whatever he had been relying on for the past 9 months, could not find any of it in this room, with this footage, playing in this light, and his head went down. Webb said yes. He said it in the voice he used when he issued a ruling from the bench, the voice that was the end of the argument. That is him. The school principal from Wicker Park, who was the jury foreperson, wrote 3 words in her notepad. She pressed the pen down harder than necessary and drew a line beneath them. Shane Briggs was 25 years old, and he had the face of someone who had aged several years in the 9 months since the arrest. Not in the way that people age when they are simply getting older, but in the way that people age when they have been carrying something heavy. And he walked to the witness stand in a plain dark suit with the particular careful pace of a man who has decided something and is now committed to the decision, and is not going to allow himself to think about it anymore, only to do it. He had resigned from the Chicago Police Department 3 weeks before the trial began. He had moved out of his apartment in Pilsen and into a smaller one in Rogers Park, and he had spent the time between his resignation and the trial doing a kind of quiet personal inventory that he had not had the courage to do while he was still wearing the badge, trying to understand the precise sequence of choices he had made and the precise moment at which each one had been a choice rather than an inevitability. Because he had spent a long time telling himself that he had not had a choice, that Kowalski's size and seniority and union backing had left him no room to act, and at some point in the quiet of the Rogers Park apartment, he had stopped believing that. He passed Kowalski's table on the way to the stand. He did not look at Kowalski. He looked straight ahead. Kowalski looked at him with the concentrated fury of a man watching his last defense position fall. Briggs took the oath. His voice cracked slightly on the final phrase, and he cleared his throat and straightened and looked at Owens. She walked him through the night in the precise, methodical sequence she used for all her witnesses, and he confirmed it all. The traffic stop that began before they left the cruiser as a decided action, not a response to observed behavior. The camera, the force, the booking, the locker room conversation, the supplemental report, the false signature. He confirmed that he had signed a document he knew to be untrue and that he had done so because Kowalski had told him in the locker room after they understood who Webb was that their stories had to match, that the cameras had been off, that it was just their word. Then Owens said, "Officer Briggs, can you tell the court exactly what Officer Kowalski said to you in the vehicle before he exited to approach Judge Webb's car?" Briggs said it the way you say something you have rehearsed, not for performance but for accuracy. The way you say something that you have been carrying in your memory for 9 months and need to set down correctly. "Nice car." "Wrong neighborhood, wrong color," Briggs said. "Let me show you how we keep the peace out here, kid." The room absorbed this in silence. Owens said, "And did he say anything to you during the assault? Anything that you heard while you were standing at the rear of the vehicle?" Briggs said yes. He said Kowalski told the man on the hood, "You're just another suit who thinks the rules don't apply to him." Then he said, "Out here, I'm the judge." At the defense table, Kowalski's hand gripped the edge of the mahogany table. His knuckles went white. His jaw tightened until a muscle flickered visibly beneath his cheek. His eyes moved to Webb in the gallery, and for a split second before he could stop it, his mind was back on Halsted Street, back in the rain, back with the wet wool of an expensive suit under his hand, and the sound of an older man crying out as the shoulder gave way. And he had said those words standing over. That man had said them with the full confidence of a man who believed them completely. And now, here was that man sitting in the second row of a federal courtroom. And here was a 25-year-old kid he had trusted saying the words back, saying them into a federal microphone, saying them onto the permanent record of the United States court system. And the irony of those particular words in this particular room with the federal judge as the victim registered across every face in the gallery in a wave that began at the front and moved to the back. Kowalski looked away from Webb. He looked down. He did not look up again for a very long time. Owens asked about the camera. Briggs confirmed that Kowalski had tapped his own off before leaving the cruiser and had told Briggs to keep his dark, and that this instruction had been given not urgently but as a matter of routine, the way you tell a new partner how things are done. Delvecchio's cross was what it had to be under the circumstances, which was an attack on Briggs's credibility, on the federal proffer he had been offered, on the cowardice of a man who had saved himself by sacrificing someone else. And Briggs absorbed all of it, and then said simply, "I filed a false report, and I signed my name to it. And I know what I did, and I am not here to save myself. I am here because that man on the witness stand deserved better than what we gave him that night. And I knew it then, and I did it anyway, and I cannot fix that. But I can stand here and tell the truth now." Delvecchio had no follow-up that would help. The murmur that ran through the gallery when Delvecchio announced the defense calls Dale Kowalski was the murmur of a room full of experienced observers who all know the same thing at the same time, which is that a criminal defendant who takes the stand in his own defense has generally reached the stage of the proceedings at which the alternative to desperate measures is no longer available. Kowalski walked to the stand with the remnant of his swagger, not the full version, but the ghost of it, the muscle memory of a man who has spent 11 years walking into rooms with physical confidence and cannot entirely abandon the performance even now. And he sat, and he put his hands on the arms of the chair, and he looked at Delvecchio with the expression of a man who is placing his faith in the one remaining option. Delvecchio's direct examination was a careful construction, a portrait of a police officer in a difficult district making a difficult call on a dark and rainy night with imperfect information. And Kowalski performed it with a practiced solemnity, the voice dropping to the register of serious confession when he described his fear, the wife and 2 sons he had mentioned as useful biographical details, the tinted windows, the dark, The rain, the impossible arithmetic of a split-second decision made by a man who simply wanted to go home. He denied Briggs's account of the pre-stop conversation. He called the footage misleading without context. He called the text message locker room talk between guys who blew off steam after difficult shifts. Owens did not carry anything to the center of the floor. She walked there with her hands at her sides and looked at Kowalski for a long moment before speaking. She walked him methodically through his own testimony, and he confirmed each piece. Yes, he was terrified. Yes, he only wanted to go home. Yes, the footage was out of context. And then she said, "Mr. Kowalski, I would like to introduce Exhibit 47. She described it without inflection. Data extracted from the defendant's personal cell phone under a federal warrant issued in the 5th month of the investigation. In particular, the contents of a group text thread titled Second District Brotherhood, and specifically a message sent from the defendant's phone at 12:17 a.m. on the night of November 14th, while Judge Webb was in the precinct booking area. She asked him if he would like to read the message to the court. He said he did not recall the specific message. She read it herself, standing in the center of the floor, reading in the flat, level voice of someone reciting evidence that does not require theatrical assistance. Bagged a live one on Halstead's suit in a car, thought he was somebody, put him on the hood, and tuned him up. Good body cam, stayed dark, LOL. She said the 3 letters at the end with the same inflection she had used for the rest of the sentence, not mocking them, not emphasizing them, simply reading them. And the effect of that neutrality of the LOL being delivered as information rather than ammunition was more devastating than any emphasis could have been, because it let the jury hear it for what it was. The foreperson covered her mouth. 2 jurors in the back row looked at each other and looked away. Owens stepped close to the witness box. She said, "You weren't terrified, Mr. Kowalski," and her voice was not loud, and she said you were bragging, and she turned her back on him and looked at the jury and said, "Tell that to the torn rotator cuff," and she walked back to her seat and sat down. Kowalski said it was locker room talk. It was a joke, and the words landed in the courtroom with the hollow inadequacy of something said after the moment in which words could still help. Delvecchio looked at the table. Delvecchio went first in closing arguments, and he was not the man he had been on day 1 of the trial. Was not the shark in the custom suit projecting unassailable confidence, was a man working with the materials available, which were fewer than he had expected. He pleaded with the jury to consider the impossibility of policing in Chicago. He begged them not to ruin a 10-year veteran's life over 5 seconds of misjudged adrenaline and a tasteless, out-of-context text message. It was the closing argument of a man who does not believe his own words. Patricia Owens stood and did not pace and did not perform, and looked at the jury moving from face to face the way she always did, reaching each person briefly and personally, and then moving on. And she said, "We give our police officers extraordinary power." And she said it quietly because the words themselves had weight and did not need volume. And she said, "The power to detain, the power to use force, the power to make decisions that change a person's life forever. And we give them this power because we have to, because a society requires someone to hold the line between order and chaos. And in exchange for that power, we ask for one thing, not gratitude, not deference. One thing, accountability to the same law they enforce." She said that Dale Kowalski had believed the law was something he applied to other people, that the badge was a shield against the accountability. It was supposed to represent that the camera being off and the rookie being compliant and the arrest report being what he needed it to say were simply tools available to a man who had decided that consequences were for the people he pulled over, not for himself. She named his choices in sequence one by one, the camera before he left the cruiser, the instruction to Briggs, the force on the hood, the knee in the spine, the fabricated report and the text at 12:17, while the man he had assaulted was bleeding 60 feet away. And she said, "These are not the choices of a frightened officer. These are the choices of a man who did not believe he would ever have to answer for them. She looked at the jury and she said, Judge Marcus Webb was not special on the night of November 14th. He was a citizen, and the only difference between what happened to him and what happens to people who have no way to fight back is that he had the standing and the resources and the knowledge of the law to hold the man who hurt him accountable. And she said, every person in this country deserves that, and the only way to make it true is to hold the badge accountable when it fails them. And she said, find him guilty, and she sat down, and the room was very quiet. The jury was out for 2 hours and 41 minutes. When the note came out, the attorneys on both sides were still in the building, and the gallery had not fully dispersed and had to be recalled from the hallway and the coffee station on the floor below. And the 2 hours and 41 minutes felt in the room when the jury filed back in like a deliberation that had been longer than it needed to be, because the 12 people doing the deliberating had chosen to be thorough rather than fast. The right side of the gallery, the side that had been occupied by off-duty officers in plain clothes since the first pretrial hearing, was noticeably thinner than it had been. Several had left after the text message was read into the record. Several more had left during Briggs's testimony. The institution was already cutting its losses. The foreperson, the school principal from Wicker Park, stood and held the verdict form. The way you hold something that is both important and settled, and she read each count in the clear, unhurried voice of a woman who teaches children not to rush through things that matter. On the count of deprivation of rights, under color of law, guilty. On the count of obstruction of justice, guilty. On the count of witness tampering and intimidation, guilty. Kowalski received each word with his eyes on the table, completely motionless. A man sitting still because the alternative was falling apart publicly, and he had not yet reached the point of not caring about that. Owen stood immediately after the verdict was received and made her request for remand, which was granted, and then she said, Your Honor, there is one additional matter the government wishes to place on the record, and she said it with the particular cadence of someone who has saved something for the moment when the main event is concluded and the room is still paying attention. She informed the court that, based on evidence derived from the 2nd District Brotherhood text thread, a federal grand jury had convened that morning and had returned indictments against Officer Brandon Hoyt and Sergeant Craig Dufresne for conspiracy to deprive civil rights and for the coordinated obstruction of multiple federal and local investigations across a period of 3 years. Kowalski's head came up. His mouth fell open. He looked at Owens, and the look on his face was the look of a man who has just understood fully and completely, and with no remaining possibility of denial, that by carrying his personal phone into the precinct on the night of November 14th and typing those 3 lowercase letters into a group text at 12:17 in the morning, he had not only destroyed himself but had handed the Department of Justice the thread that connected him to a network of men who had believed. As he had believed that the cameras being off and the stories matching were all that stood between what they did and what anyone would ever know about it. 2 U.S. Marshals stepped up behind him, and he was told to put his hands behind his back. The cuffs went on. The same cold, definitive click that had gone on Judge Webb's wrists on Halsted Street 9 months ago. Kowalski was turned to face the gallery for the walk to the side door. Every officer who had previously occupied the right rows was watching. Every civil rights observer in the left rows was watching. Every reporter with a pen hovering over a notepad was watching. And in the second row, Marcus Ellington Webb was watching with the solemn, settled attention of the justice system at work. Not with satisfaction and not with triumph, but with the specific gravity of a man who has waited a long time for a reckoning to arrive, and is now watching it arrive and finds that the arrival is quieter than he expected, is less about victory than about the simple, necessary completion of something that should not have been left incomplete. Kowalski looked at him for a fraction of a second. He looked away. He could not hold it. The marshals walked him forward, his shoes on the marble floor, step by step, the courtroom watching in silence. Past the gallery rows, past the reporters, past the civil rights observers who had driven here from 3 different states to see this. past the empty right side rows where the plainclothes officers used to sit all the way to the side door which opened and closed behind him. And then he was gone. 90 days later, Chicago, in late January, was the version of itself that the city reserves for the months when it wants to remind you that it is serious. The wind off Lake Michigan, coming in horizontal and cold enough to make the Dirksen Federal Building's reinforced windows rattle in their frames, and courtroom 14 was sealed against it still, and the stillness had the quality of a room that has been here before, that has held this kind of weight before, that knows what it is for. Kowalski was brought in through the side door by 2 U.S. Marshals, and the transformation that 90 days of federal custody had produced was something the gallery registered and held in its collective memory, because this was not the barrel-chested officer in the expensive gray suit. This was a man in an orange MCC jumpsuit that hung on a frame that had lost substantial weight with the fluorescent pallor of someone who had not been outside for months, with eyes that moved around the room quickly and with none of their old confidence, and with ankle chains that produced a sound on the courtroom floor that was audible in the silence, a thin metallic note that accompanied each shuffling step. The rows where the off-duty officers had sat were empty. The Fraternal Order of Police had formally withdrawn its support of Dale Kowalski 48 hours after the 2nd District Brotherhood indictments were made public, the institution cutting a limb and moving on. Del Vecchio made his plea for leniency with the subdued delivery of a man who has been to this particular defeat before and knows the shape it takes, invoking the years of service and the family and the single terrible lapse. And then he sat down. Judge Patricia Holloway looked down at Kowalski and said, "Does the victim wish to address the court?" And Webb said, "Yes, Your Honor," and stood. Marcus Ellington Webb walked to the podium in a charcoal suit that sat perfectly on his shoulders, the left one carrying its surgery scar invisibly under the wool, and he did not look at Kowalski first. He looked at Holloway. Then he looked at the room. Then he began. He said, "For 33 years I have served the law." He said it without preamble, the way a man states a fact he is not interested in debating. And he said, "I have devoted the whole of my professional life to the belief that the American justice system, for all of its documented failures and historical blind spots, and the genuine harm it has done to real people in ways that I have witnessed up close from multiple sides of the courtroom, is still the best available architecture we have for protecting the dignity of individuals against the unchecked exercise of power. I have handed down sentences that took away men's freedom," he said, "and I have dismissed charges when the state overreached, and I have done all of it in the belief that the system, when operated by people of integrity, produces more justice than any alternative we have invented." He gripped the edges of the podium. He said, "But on the night of November 14th, Mr. Kowalski gave me something I had not expected to receive, which was a first-hand physical reminder of the exact conditions under which that system fails. He said when I was pulled from my vehicle and put on the hood of my car in the rain, I did not announce my title. This was not an oversight. It was an understanding, which is that titles do not stop knees, and that out on the street, in the dark and the rain, the law that I had spent 33 years defending was not there with me, and the only thing present was Dale Kowalski's judgment about what I deserved. He said Mr. Kowalski saw a black man in a good car on a street he considered his, and he decided that the law was something he enforced upon that man rather than something that protected him, and that is not a mistake. A mistake is misreading a license plate. A mistake is taking a wrong turn, beating a compliant unarmed man, turning off a recording device to hide the evidence, coercing a subordinate into participating in a conspiracy, and then laughing about it in a text message is not a mistake. It is a decision made from a set of beliefs about who the law was for and who it was against. And those beliefs did not begin on November 14th, and would not have ended there if the camera above the ATM alcove had not been pointing at the right piece of street at the right moment. Then he turned. He turned slowly toward the defense table and looked directly at Kowalski, and this was the moment the gallery remembered, the one the reporters transcribed in full, and the civil rights observers noted in their records. And that stayed with everyone who was present for the rest of the time they spent thinking about this case, because Webb looked at Kowalski with the same unhurried total attention he had given him from the back seat of the cruiser 9 months ago. He said, "I do not stand here asking for vengeance." His voice was quiet and clear and entirely without performance. He said, "I am asking this court to apply the unyielding standard of the law without modification, because if I had been anyone else that night, if I had been a teacher driving home from an evening class, or a retired grandfather heading back from a late dinner, or a young man working a second shift, that person would have had no recourse against the fabricated report and the off-camera and the blue wall. That person would be sitting where Mr. Kowalski is sitting, convicted on the basis of Kowalski's word. And I ask that the sentence handed down today say clearly and without qualification that no one is above the law they are sworn to enforce." He stepped away from the podium and returned to his seat. The room was very quiet. Judge Patricia Holloway looked at Kowalski for a long time before she spoke. She said, "I have read the pre-sentencing materials, the letters from your family, and the full record of the trial. And I have considered your attorney's request that I weigh your years of service. And I have considered it, and I find that the evidence presented at trial makes it entirely plausible that Judge Marcus Webb was simply the first person you encountered who had both the standing and the resources to stop you, and that the conduct documented in this record did not begin with him and would not have ended with him." She said, "On the federal charge of deprivation of rights under color of law, I sentence you to 84 months in the custody of the Bureau of Prisons. On the charge of obstruction of justice, I sentence you to 24 additional months to be served consecutively. The total sentence is 108 months, 9 years to be served without the possibility of early parole." She said, "Furthermore, as a direct consequence of this federal felony conviction, your municipal pension is forfeited in full. The liquidated amount will be distributed as follows: $15,600 in direct restitution to Arthur Gaines to be paid immediately and in full. The remaining balance, calculated at $47,200, will fund the 2nd District Community Civil Rights Legal Aid Fund, which will provide representation to residents of the 2nd District who believe their civil rights have been violated and who cannot afford private counsel." She set down the document. She looked at Kowalski one more time. She said, "The gavel comes down not because you were caught, but because you were wrong, and there is a difference that matters." The gavel struck the bench. Once, sharp and final as a period at the end of a long sentence. Kowalski's knees buckled. Del Vecchio had to grab his arm to keep him upright. The ankle chains rang against the floor. 9 years, no pension, no badge, no future in law enforcement. His entire life's work, his financial security, and his freedom vaporized by his own uncontrollable certainty that he was exempt from the consequences he spent 11 years imposing on other people. The marshals stepped forward. "Hands behind your back," one of them said. The cuffs went on for the last time. Kowalski was turned to face the gallery and walked toward the side door, the ankle chains marking every step on the marble floor, and the gallery watched in the silence of people who have seen something important concluded. And as he passed the second row, he looked one more time at Marcus Ellington Webb. Webb did not look away, did not offer contempt or grief or satisfaction. He offered what he had offered every time their eyes had met since the arrest, which was the simple, settled, unhurried attention of a man who has finished a piece of work and is present for its conclusion. Not personal, not triumphant, just complete. Kowalski looked at the floor. The side door opened. He was gone. Captain Gerald Sutter submitted his retirement paperwork that afternoon, effective immediately, and cleared his desk by 5 o'clock and did not say goodbye to many people. Shane Briggs heard the verdict from Colorado, where he had relocated 4 months earlier, where he was working a transitional job in park maintenance and sleeping better than he had in a year. Not well exactly, but better. And he read the news on his phone at a diner counter over a cup of coffee and sat with it for a long moment before putting the phone back in his pocket. And what he felt was not vindicated and was not relieved exactly, was something quieter and harder to name, the feeling of a debt that cannot be fully repaid but has been partially acknowledged. Hoyt and Dufresne's cases moved forward through the federal system, their trials scheduled for the following year. The 2nd District Brotherhood text thread becoming in the legal filings a document that the Department of Justice Civil Rights Division cited in a formal report on informal communication practices within large urban police departments, a report that generated policy changes at the federal level, and Kowalski's 3 lowercase letters traveled further than he had imagined possible when he typed them at a red light on a rainy Tuesday night on Halsted Street. Late in the afternoon of sentencing day, the Honorable Judge Marcus Ellington Webb walked through the corridor to his chambers, and his clerk had left the afternoon docket on his desk, as always. 14 cases, the day's work remaining, the law continuing. Webb sat down. He opened the first file. He read, Dale Kowalski stood in the concrete recreation yard at FCY Terre Haute at 6 in the morning. In the 1 hour of outdoor time, the special housing unit schedule permitted him wearing a gray prison-issue sweatshirt against a cold that had found its way into his bones, and he watched a guard walk the perimeter of the yard with the heavy, deliberate swagger of a man who has learned to use his physical presence as a statement. The same swagger Kowalski had carried on Halsted Street, the same hand near the belt, the same manufactured weight in each step, and Kowalski watched it from the other side, and understood in the way you only understand something when it is turned toward you, what that swagger had always looked like to the people it was aimed at. He said nothing. He went back inside. The 2nd District Precinct opened under new command the following spring, with a civilian oversight board that reviewed body camera compliance weekly and whose members were required to include residents of the communities the district served. Arthur Gaines cashed his restitution check on a Thursday morning and put it in the register of his shop because the shop was what mattered and the shop was still there. On the wall beside his business license, he hung a small handwritten sign that said, "Simply write everything down." A block away, a young officer getting ready to begin his shift activated his body camera before he stepped out of the car. Not because anyone was watching. Not because a supervisor had reminded him, but because he had decided that was the kind of officer he was going to be. On a Tuesday morning, 6 months after the sentencing, the Honorable Judge Marcus Ellington Webb sat on the federal bench in courtroom 14, and before him stood a young black public defender in her first year of practice, nervous and over-prepared and braced for the kind of dismissal that first-year defenders learn to expect from federal courtrooms. And she argued her motion carefully and thoroughly, and Webb listened to every word with the same deliberate, unhurried attention he gave every attorney who stood before him, regardless of experience or reputation or the size of the case they were carrying. And when she was done, he ruled in her favor because the law required it and for no other reason. And he watched her gather her papers with shaking hands and look up at him with something new in her eyes, and he allowed himself one small thing, a single slow nod. And then he opened the next file because there was always more work, and because the work was what mattered, and because this was in the end the only answer worth giving. If this story moved you, if you believe that accountability matters, and that no one, not even someone with a badge, should be above the law they swore to enforce, please take a moment right now to like this video and subscribe to our channel so you never miss a story like this one. Share it with someone you know because these stories matter most when they reach the people who need to hear them. We will see you in the next one.